I am 66 years old, and for 40 years I kept a living secret in a barn on the edge of the Cascades. I don't tell that lightly. It sits with me like a loose nail you never quite kick out. Always there, sometimes aching, sometimes dull. Always a reminder of a choice I made when I was 26 and thought I could do the work the world didn't know how to do. If you value quiet stories about people who protected what they loved, stick around to the end. If that sounds like something you want to hear more of, consider subscribing and leaving a like. It helps stories that ask for sympathy get heard. Thanks for staying. August 14th, 1984. I'll never forget the heat that day. How the air hazed over the firs and the cedar sap smelled sharp when I split a log. I had been doing odd carpentry jobs up on my uncle's property since he died the winter before. The place sat a little higher than the valley. A dip of a house, a rattly old barn with a sagging loft and a run of fence that hadn't held stock in years. I was 26, the sort of man who'd been taught to fix things until they stopped breaking. That afternoon, I went out to patch a section of fence laced with barbed wire and to see what of the shed I could salvage for lumber. I had my .22 with me because the coyotes had been getting fresh in the evenings and my hands were stained with pitch. I saw it at the edge of a clearing, maybe 30 yards off. It was large, larger than any black bear around here, and hunched like a man in a coat made of 100 coats. It moved awkwardly, like something that hadn't learned how to walk across a meadow. When it turned, it looked at me in a way that settled something cold into my knees. I don't know what passed in my head. Fear, reflex, the little knot of authority you feel with a gun in your hand, but I raised the rifle. I don't remember saying a word. I remember the crack and seeing it stumble and clutch at its side with hands that were almost human and too big. It made a sound that folded in on itself, like someone trying to swallow a storm. "I shot him" is the sentence folks lean toward when they read a headline. He shot something big. But there are layers to that moment. I didn't shoot to kill. I shot because I was scared, and the life in front of me was moving like a thing that might take something from me. The bullet hit low, missed the spine, lodged in the muscle under the ribs. He collapsed. He was bleeding, but alive. I remember the way he tried to pull himself toward the trees, and I remember stepping in and catching his fall, because I couldn't stand the thought of him dragging himself over the rocks and howling until whatever had wounded him finished the job. He smelled of pine resin, wet hair, and something like old earth. Up close, his eyes were not animal. There was a depth to them that made me lower my voice even when I wasn't speaking. He looked at me like an animal looks at its rescuer, like it had been waiting for someone to decide whether to help or walk away. I dragged him the best I could. He was heavy, maybe 600 pounds, and awkward in the way of something built for the climb, not for being carried on a shoulder. I got him to the barn after dark. The barn was a crude sanctuary. A loft bed I'd built the month before, stacks of hay, my tools along the walls, an oil lamp that threw more shadow than light. I closed the big doors and propped boards across the windows so nosy eyes wouldn't see the movement inside. I called the county's emergency line that night because my hands were shaking and I knew bleeding that much could turn fast. Of course, I didn't tell them what I had. I told them a man had walked into my place, an accident with a rifle, please send an ambulance. By the time I heard the siren fade on the gravel, I had wrapped the wound with what I had: gauze from a first aid kit, a length of torn t-shirt. He slept like someone exhausted, chest rising and falling, sometimes fast, sometimes like a bellows. I stayed up and watched him, propping the lamp so the light didn't hit his face. I had to keep looking, because if I let my eyes leave him, reality bent too far, and I might have to say no to the thing that had been wounded under my hands. 4 days later, there were men in uniforms at the edge of the property. They'd shown up on August 18, saying neighbors had reported sounds, footprints, something out of the ordinary. That was the beginning of other people's curiosity touching us, first with gloved hands, then with clipboards, then with the hard, bureaucratic voice of things that take an interest. I kept him quiet. I closed the barn tighter, bedded him in fresh hay, fed him from a bucket, carrots, boiled potatoes, the odd thing from my own dinner. He had favorites quickly. He liked the taste of boiled chicken and would cradle a carrot in his vast fingers, using his thumbs like he was learning how to hold utensils. He didn't name himself. I did. I called him Samuel because it was a name with a plainness that felt right for what he was, patient and fierce and old in an interior that belied his physical strength. We learned as much as two beings can learn each other's rhythms. He could not speak in any language I knew, not at first, but he learned to watch and to repeat. He learned to point with his chin. He learned that if he placed his palm over his chest and then over mine, I would understand that he meant something like trust. So I made him a picture card. It was a scrap of cardboard with a stick figure and a little heart drawn where a stomach would be. That became our first sentence. Every morning I would show him the card. If he returned that gesture, hand over chest, I'd lay food out. If not, I would leave him to sleep. That exchange grew into a rudimentary grammar over the years. A flashcard with bread, a picture of a bed, a scrawled radio when he wanted music. Simple, stupid things, and yet it was conversation enough for two beings who had no shared alphabet. When the federal people came that first month, I lied. I told them I'd heard something in the woods, that I'd shot at a man who I thought had a rifle. They asked for names, for reports. I had none. I showed them my property records, my card with the carpentry shop, the hole in my fence. They sent a man from a state division to look around, laptops and cameras in the back of a truck that smelled like cold metal. They dusted for prints and took samples of hair from a line of brush I had cordoned off. I sat inside while they worked the perimeter, and my hands kept finding the little scar on my thumb from the very first screw I ever drove. After that first visit, we boarded the barn up better. I dug a small tunnel out to the tree line between 87 and 88. Kept it modest, a passage no one would notice unless they knew to look, and built a sort of enclosure within the barn where Samuel could move without coming to the front doors. The idea was never to keep him locked like an animal. It was to give him a place that would be stable, warm, safe from wind and rain, and away from the prying eyes of men who would not understand how to look at him with anything but profit. Those early years were the hardest. People called, engines roared in the valley below, and I was a single man with a secret weighing like a second winter coat. I learned to sleep with one ear on the barn door. I learned to where the nearest trail was, how to spot tracks, which neighbors had dogs that wandered, and which had eyes that held gossip like coal in a pocket. I learned that keeping such a thing quiet was more about minding the mundane than about hiding in caves. You keep bellies fed, you keep fences mended, you return borrowed tools, you pay your property taxes, and you behave so ordinary that people stop looking. Samuel was patient. He learned time in rhythms, supply runs, the smell of coffee in the morning, the seasons. He preferred music in the late afternoons when the light slanted through the slats of the barn and made the dust into soft snow. He took to classical sometimes, a slow cello that made his breathing even. Other times he wanted something with a beat. We found Michael Jackson on an old cassette, and the way he tried to clap to it, his big hands missing the rhythm, made us laugh like fools. Music became a bridge. I would sit with my hand on his arm and watch him learn to anticipate the swell of a phrase, the way a child watches for a parent's face after the punchline of a joke. In 1985, there came a storm that took part of the roof off the barn. We lost a week of dry bedding, and the shingles blew down into the meadow like the skins of dead whales. Samuel hated that week. Wetness made him stiff, and he would not sleep. He pressed himself against the wood stove, wintered his face into my shirt, and we both learned the meaning of small comforts. A patch of waterproof canvas, a bowl of warm broth. In 1986, a spark from an old wiring box crept into hay, and we had a fire that licked the edge of the loft before I got the bucket and the pump and smothered it. That night I heard something like a sob from a being whose vocal cords had never learned our language. Samuel hated that week. Wetness made him stiff, and he would not sleep. I pressed himself against the wood stove, wintered his face into my shirt, and we both learned the meaning of small comforts. A patch of waterproof canvas, a bowl of warm broth. In 1986, a spark from an old wiring box crept into hay, and we had a fire that licked the edge of the loft before I got the bucket and the pump and smothered it. That night I heard something like a sob from a being whose vocal cords had never learned our language. Samuel had been scared of the flames, the way any child is. We put out the embers, and I rebuilt the loft by hand that winter, hammering wood with a kind of penitent rhythm. I was not always the only one who knew. Over the years, a circle grew, small, chosen, practical. My nephew David stumbled into the secret after a spring when a rescuer at a ranger station mentioned a strange pattern of wood knocks on the edge of his beats. David is a ranger by trade, iron-jawed, grave-faced, the kind of man who can read a forest like an old friend's face. He swore he'd keep his mouth shut. He came out one night, parka zipped to his chin, and saw Samuel for the first time, with embarrassment like a child caught spying. Instead of running, he sat down, took off his hat, and talked to Samuel about the weather, as if the being could answer. The gesture did more to bind us than any legal oath. David brought Emily later, his wife, a biologist who could not conceal the thrill of a cataloging mind, but who also had a tenderness that matched mine. She carried an odd mix of clinical curiosity and something like alarm. She wanted to measure, to test, to take DNA swabs under sterile conditions. She also cried the first time Samuel laid his forehead to hers.
Dr. Lisa Chen came in 2008, veterinary trained and careful with needles and consent. She became our discreet triage nurse and negotiator with the outside world when illnesses came that needed more than home remedies. Life, once I had given myself to it, settled into rhythms of provision, grocery runs into town, the careful rotation of hay, drilling a small secret well for extra water in the late 1990s, the slow expansion of the property with 2 parcels bought in 94 and 96 so that the ring of woods around us would be thicker to the eyes of any aviation or road maintenance crew. The tunnels we dug were not sinister. They were practical. A hidden route if Samuel wished to go into the pines, and a way for us to move things without drawing attention. There was a small generator tucked away for cold snaps, a set of cots and blankets for the nights when the roof leaked, a closed cabinet full of antibiotics and syringes kept under Lisa's instruction. Communication stayed humble. We taught him a set of picture cards over years, hand-drawn, worn at the corners. The card of a house meant stay. The card of an open field meant he could go. A sketch of a heart with a hand over it meant family.
He learned to tilt his head when he wanted affirmation, and to place a rock on the card when he wanted us to know he'd chosen it. Those small rituals were our language, and they proved enough for years. Time passed. Years folded into decades the way the river wraps itself around a stone. There were seasons of quiet and seasons of worry. In 1994 and 1996, we bought those parcels at tax auctions, the bank clerks never the wiser. And I spent the better part of 2 summers running fence and planting windbreaks. Samuel watched the planting with something like reverence, pressing his palm against the first sprout of a fir as if to bless it. He liked to sit under the trees after a rain, the ground cool against his back, looking at the world the way a man looks at photographs of his childhood. Not all crises were of the external sort. In 2008, he took a fever that refused to break. He woke at night, restless, and his breathing sounded thin. Lisa came out despite the difficulty of getting to our place in a storm. She treated infection with antibiotics and a small surgery to remove an abscess that had been festering under his arm. We moved him to a makeshift recovery area in the loft and watched him sleep through the pain relief. He was sedated in a way that made him dreamy and soft, and I sat with the back of my hand pressed to his fur where the wound had been, because touch was the only prayer I had fit for such a thing. He woke days later and found his hand on mine. He met my eyes and made a low sound that was almost a name. We cried then, David, Emily, Lisa, and me. Not because we had won, but because we had been spared for the moment. We documented everything in the way people do when they know the world may wish to take a thing away. Photographs with timestamps, journals, copies of receipts for hay, the dates of vaccinations in Lisa's handwriting, an incremental ledger of the food consumed each month. Emily kept a scientific notebook that smelled of paper and solvent, full of notes about gait, measured heights, and tentative genetic samples she stored with a seriousness that bordered on ritual. Some of the tests suggested, in her handwriting, that his DNA shared similarities with archaic hominids. Not a proclamation of origins, but a cautious hypothesis written with hedged language. Those notes would later become both shield and bait. The weight of secrecy grows in peculiar ways. It is not merely the practical care of another creature, but a moral architecture you build inside yourself. I learned to lie with the same casualness with which I fixed a leaky faucet. I lied to neighbors who asked about the sounds at night. I lied to childhood friends who stopped by because they saw my truck at odd hours.
I learned to rehearse explanations that would not wobble under questioning. Each falsehood was a small stone laid on a road I had chosen.
System. On December the 3rd, his breathing faltered and the light in his eyes thinned. We all came into the barn then, David and Emily, Lisa with her medical kit, and me with hands that had learned to hold a heart. We made him warm. We fed him broth and put the old cassette player on, the Michael Jackson tape cued to a soft song that had soothed him for years. He knew the sound and settled a little, his head heavy on a stack of hay. He died between the night of December 3rd and the morning of December 4th, 2021, slowly, quietly, the way someone decides to stop fighting a fever when the body simply gives in. There was no great outcry, no dramatic collapse. There was a hand on my arm, and his hand, warmer than I expected, resting over my fingers. I said his name, Samuel, because it felt like the only thing to do, and he made that low sound that had been his small word for gratitude. He took a last breath that I felt more than heard, and then his chest stilled. We did not scream. We cleaned him with the reverence of family members who know the body will return to the earth. We wrapped him in a blanket Emily had bought at a market in '07, marked his fur at the shoulder with a ribbon, and wrote a few notes in an old journal. The world outside did not know yet. We had 11 days before the cameras came, and in those 11 days we did what must be done. We arranged for a cremation that would keep his ashes away from exploiters. We drew up documents that would ensure limited access to our archives. And we decided, what I insist now was the right thing, to make the reveal ourselves rather than have it forced upon us. The public reveal came on December 15, 2021, a little over a week after he had died. Agent Sarah Thornton arrived that day with a team that smelled of bureaucracy and caution. She is not a villain in my telling. She is a woman in a uniform who had been sent to speak to men who keep things out of sight. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, she used words that balanced legal concern with a human curiosity that sometimes makes a person dangerous in its softness. The cameras were already circling by then, and the thing that made everything dark was not the cameras themselves, but the suddenness of attention, how a life you had shaped with patience can be flattened into a single sentence by strangers hungry for a scoop. We showed them the journals, the photographs, the timestamps on the tapes. We handed over selected samples because we had no wish for a drawn-out seizure of property, and because Emily insisted the scientific record mattered. The footage leaked. The nation loved a spectacle. Headlines said things I had not said. People wrote that I had hidden a monster, others that I had saved an intelligence. There were legal threats and offers, angry letters, and men on talk radio who could not bear the idea of a thing they couldn't tax. There were also letters from strangers who thanked me for giving him dignity. The arc of response was as wide as the sky. When the government moved in, the tone shifted. Meetings took on the cold geometry of rooms where people tried to make every outcome logical. Agent Thornton negotiated with us, a messy, human conversation about custody, about the archive, about whether his remains would be sequestered or shared. They proposed containment. We proposed a cremation that would scatter the ashes in the riparian valley where he liked to sit and watch the fog. In the end, we bargained. We traded some access to the files for the right to what I insisted upon, that we scatter the ashes ourselves. This was the first time my hand shook in public. Standing under a low sky the year after, with the wind like an old accomplice, we let the ash go where the river bends. I thought of the first day I had held him, and of the card with the heart, and I said his name into the wind as if it would hear. The world recorded it anyway, because someone had placed a microphone too near. We relished a privacy that lasted only a handful of hours, but those hours were all weight that made the rest bearable. And I will tell you this plainly. I do not regret the choice to hide him. There are other things that press on me, regrets about being too slow, about nights I let worry keep me apart. But the fundamental choice I made when I lifted that rifle and then lowered it to patch a wound instead of delivering a verdict, that choice I would make again. He was not an experiment to be catalogued without consent. He was a life that deserved the little dignity we could give him. We did our best. There is a ledger of legal papers and an archive box labeled for institutional eyes only, stored in a safe place under terms we hammered out with signatures and counsel, and, later, constraints that would allow researchers limited access under conditions we set. Emily insisted because she feared his memory would be reduced to sensational photographs. David insisted because he wanted the land to remain wild. Lisa insisted because she had held his fevered head and sworn to a quiet oath. I insisted because, at the end, my hands were the ones that had tucked him in. When the cameras came, everything turned dark. Not only because the glare of lights erases the small shapes in the corners, but because once people could profit off a story, the compassion got crowded out by what they wanted to take. The government wanted control, the media wanted spectacle, the public wanted answers. We wanted to keep the dignity of a life that had trusted us. Those aims are not the same, and so the fight was never merely legal. It was ethical. It was how you teach a nation to treat a mystery, with curiosity and with care, not with immediate ownership. People asked later whether I had any idea of how to prepare for such attention. I would be lying if I said I did. You don't plan for being the keeper of a life like that. You learn.
You learn to be secretive in ways that are not shameful but protective. You learn to ask for help from people who will keep your counsel. You learn that sometimes the most humane act is to refuse the easy path. Those early years, 1984 through the late 80s, the fire, the tunnel, the learning of cards, taught me that tenderness and stubbornness go hand in hand. They taught me that in a world that prizes naming and owning, sometimes the fiercest act of resistance is to refuse the market and insist on privacy. They taught me that love can be literal and ordinary. It sits in the grain of a loaf, the way a hand makes tea, the quiet mending of a torn blanket. There is a long part of the story that comes after the reveal. Legal arguments, public reaction, and finally cremation on September 1st, 2023. But those are chapters that need time to breathe. For now, I keep the small objects, the edge of a picture card browned by years of thumb, an old cassette labeled MJ, a ribbon we've kept folded in a drawer. They are the proof of a life that was not made into a circus by us.
If there's one thing I hope you take from this, it's that the right thing is not always the easiest, and sometimes keeping a secret is the only way to give someone a life worth living. After that, the public machinery found its rhythm, an appetite for clarity, for culpability, for something to file neatly into a headline. We learned quickly that grief is porous in the face of spectacle. It seeps into systems that are not made for tenderness. The suits arrived first. Letters with embossed headers, subpoenas, polite threats folded into legalese. The journalists came next, softer at first, then louder, smelling not only a story, but the chance to be the one who had obtained it. The government sent men in plain suits, not for comfort, but to measure risk. Each knock at the door made the house seem too small, like a vessel meant for what was private being held in a market square. We met with their representatives in rooms that were deliberately neutral. Anton sat opposite us with a file, a calm that suggested he had rehearsed neutrality until it had become a habit of his face. He spoke of precedent, of public interest, of the moral obligation to share knowledge that could alter a field. He tried to make the archives sound like a public good. I tried to make dignity sound like one too. Limited access, Emily said. Her voice never lost that edge she'd developed after years of arguing for things that had been refused to her when she was younger. Redaction, researchers vetted with no commercial release. Anton nodded as if we had proposed a reasonable compromise. Behind his eyes there was a calculation I could not name. He had been sympathetic in private, irritable in public. Where those lines crossed, we needed a fence. The lawyers drew the fence in words. That fence felt cold, but it held. There were court days, sparse, legal, the press waiting in a hallway that smelled of coffee and stale coats. I gave a statement at one point, short and direct, because my counselor advised it. My voice was steadier than I felt. They asked if we had considered handing everything over. I said we had considered many things. I said we had chosen to protect a life. I watched that phrase ripple through the room, and I watched how it landed differently depending on whether the listener wanted a myth to shoot into or a moral to eat. Lawsuits spun off from that kernel. There were families who wanted answers they felt entitled to, and there were profit seekers who thought the story could be monetized with images and speculative essays. We settled some claims in confidential agreements, the kind of closure that feels like a bandage rather than a cure. The institution, always the institution, agreed to a protocol, an independent review board with members we approved and others we did not. They agreed to a timeline, to conditions for access. The box labeled "for institutional eyes only" became "for approved researchers only," and then eventually restricted until further notice. Each change was a small victory, a small defeat. It never felt like enough, but it felt like survival. The media cycle was merciless in its appetite and patchy in its memory. For a few fevered weeks we were everything. Then news stories took their turn. But that initial glare left scars. People I had known casually, acquaintances who had once asked about my work at a party, began to call with either the language of praise or of condemnation, sometimes both in the same breath. There were threats, too, which made the nights longer. The police gave us a list of precautions, an official consolation. There were also letters I still keep folded in a box.
A woman who wrote she had buried her brother without answers, and that what we had done had given his name back to him in a quiet way. A student who told us our choice had saved her from becoming the kind of scientist who would numb curiosity with exploitation. Those letters weigh as much as any legal ruling. As the months congealed into years, the hardest part was not the arguing, but the slow accretion of consequence. People lost jobs. Reputations shifted along lines I had never considered, moral geography. Friends became cautious. Friends became distant. Lisa began sleeping in our living room for stretches, a practical answer to threats, but also a comfort born of shared memory. David spent more time on the land, tending fences and tree lines, as if the wild could be made to absorb sorrow by being left alone. Emily threw herself into the negotiations with a steadiness that was marvel and exhaustion in equal measure. We planned the cremation as we had planned the archive, with precision and with privacy.
There is a lacerating humor to being punished for trying to be humane. It is not universal. Some of my peers stood by me. I found new work in quieter places, mentoring students who wanted to ask the right kind of questions. That, in time, felt like recompense. The archive box remained a talisman. I kept the small objects, card edge browned by thumb, the cassette labeled MJ, the folded ribbon, in a drawer that I rarely opened. They were small, domestic proofs against a world that wanted everything to be grand. Sometimes, when I needed to remember why we had done what we did, I would take them out and let the light show the scars and the creases. Once, months after the cremation, I played the cassette. The tape hissed, and then a voice came through, disjointed, human, laughing at something minor. It was a privacy preserved, a sound that had no right to be public, but that existed nonetheless in the quiet of my living room. I turned it off after a few minutes because it felt like intrusion, a private listening to a private tape, and I preferred to keep the memory of that laugh intact in my head rather than scholarship. There were, inevitably, unexpected guardians. An old colleague who had once been more enamored with recognition than with caution sent a sealed envelope with a single note. You did not fail him. It was not a legal defense, not a moral justification. It was a hand extended across a gulf. Those small gestures mattered in ways larger documents could not account for. Years later, the archive protocol became a model cited in ethical discussions. People used our case as a text of teaching, both cautionary and commendatory. I received invitations to panels where I was asked to elucidate the moral calculus. I would answer plainly, there is no formula for this. There is only attention and courage. There are moments when rules bend and moments when rules bind. The only guide I trusted was the one that asked, does this preserve the person? If the answer was no, then the rest were matters of preference and fear. At home, life reassembled in quieter patterns. The seasons turned. The river held its patient courses. David rebuilt a fence that had fallen in a storm, and, over the years, planted a line of saplings that, he promised, would be something for future hands to tend. Emily found projects that grounded her. Community gardens, a small initiative to teach consent and ethics in local clinics. Lisa, who had the easiest laugh of us all, learned to let tears come cleanly, and not as a pressure that required immediate fixing. There were moments of ordinary joy that felt almost illicit after the intensity we had lived through. A meal in the garden where no one checked for quiet cameras.
A walk at dusk with Mary, our neighbor, who had once been a stranger and became a friend in the shared business of keeping things safe.
Those evenings were not sanctuaries where nothing had happened. They were the place where we learned to be human again among other humans. I admit there are nights when I also imagine the opposite life. If we had opened the box, if we had handed everything over to the world. In that alternate ledger, there are scientific leaps and banners, and perhaps faster cures. There are also people who would be reduced to specimens without consent. I do not pretend the choice was purely moral and not strategic. We were never naive about the loss of knowledge that might have been. We were simply clear that knowledge harvested without regard to personhood becomes something worse than ignorance. The story keeps going, as stories do. There were audit reports and a doctoral thesis that took 5 years to complete under the slow light of approved oversight. There were students who asked awkward questions, and those who asked the right ones. There were occasional requests to see the box itself, which we refused, and later requests to inspect the sealed items under covenant, which we granted with the conditions we had set. Each request was a negotiation. Each granted request felt like a small victory for dignity. In the end, what has remained with me is not the legality or the headlines, but those small quotidian acts of care. The box of folded ribbons, the cassette that hiccups once and then sighs into silence, the ash that now runs with the river. These things anchor me to the truth that a life is not only data, not only a point on a chart. It is tea prepared for another on a cold afternoon. It is the way someone hums without meaning to when they think no one is listening. It is the way a hand steadies another hand when it is needed most. Sometimes people ask if secrecy is always the right path when faced with a mystery. My answer is, as it always has been, it depends. Secrecy can be cowardice. Secrecy can be protection. The test is how the secrecy is used and whom it serves. If it hides wrongdoing or absolves harm, then we must pry it open for justice. If it preserves dignity and honors a life's own claims to being more than spectacle, then secrecy can be a form of fidelity. On evenings when the fog comes in to dine with the river, I walk the bend where the ashes were scattered. The place looks ordinary, which is the miracle. The world continues to take, to want, to display, but it also continues to forget what it desired yesterday. There is a mercy in that forgetfulness, when it protects what should not be an object of consumption. There are still pages of the ledger I have not read in years. There are names in there, people who had been part of the greater machinery of inquiry, whose motives I will never fully understand. There are also small, unremarkable entries. A note about a thermos of tea, a forgotten letter, a receipt from a hardware store. Those are the lines that make up the texture of a life well attended. The rest is noise. If someone asks me now what I would have done differently, my list is thin. I would have been quicker to call for help in some nights. I would have been less stubborn about certain fights that cost friendships. But the core decision, the decision to give privacy instead of spectacle, stands like a quiet, stubborn thing in my chest. It is not a white flag, nor a triumphal banner. It is a small, true thing. We chose to care. And so we keep living. We keep the small objects in drawers. We tend the land. We answer, sometimes, the letters that arrive from people who say they were moved by our choice. We continue to teach, to argue, to make the world a place that occasionally prefers tenderness to ownership. There are stories yet untold in the boxes and in the papers. There are legal appendices and footnotes that will be read by those who need them. For now, the river does its slow, patient work, carrying what must go. Tonight, rain has started on the roof, a thin, steady kind that sings against the tiles. I sit by the window and look across to the line of trees David planted. A faint light shows where someone, somewhere, perhaps Emily, has yet to put away a cup. The domestic things remain: a kettle, a rag on the counter, the way a door clicks when it latches. These are the small facts that outlast grand gestures. I do not claim to have acted with moral purity. I claim only the reality of a choice made under pressure and compassion, and the long, necessary work that followed to make that choice exist in law and in practice. People will argue about it. Scholars will cite it. Some will condemn us. Others will bless us. The thing I know for certain is that in the valley, on a day when the sky seemed to breathe, we did what we could to make a life end with honor. And sometimes, when I think the world has too little room for gentleness, I return to the drawer, touch the ribbon, and remind myself that there are kinds of stewardship that are not public achievements, but quiet acts of remembrance. That is enough for now. Sometimes, on those same evenings, someone will come by the gate and stand where the path narrows beneath the beeches. They do not always speak at first. They will wait for a while, as if testing whether the house is still a place that can hold a conversation that is not performance. Once, a woman I did not know, thin, with a letter folded inside the palm of her hand, looked at the light over the porch and then at me, and said simply, "We kept yours safe too." She did not demand stories. She brought me a photograph that had been tucked into a book for decades, and a tin of buttons that rattled when she moved them. We sat on the kitchen steps and traded small cargoes of memory until the rain stopped and the road shone like a ribbon. There is a rhythm to these exchanges. People arrive with things that have stopped being useful but cannot be thrown away, and we make room for them. Sometimes it is practical. Advice about a will, a name clarified in a ledger, but more often it is not practical at all. It is the unhurried miracle of being heard. That, too, became part of the work, not only to guard what ought to remain private, but to be present for the quiet unwrapping of grief and the awkward, grateful task of naming what remains. At the college where I teach, I bring this work into conversation with students who think in brackets and chapters. They press me about precedent and publicity. They map the arguments into syllabi and footnotes. I teach them to read the ordinary entries, the thermos, the rag, the hardware receipt, as if they were scripture of a life. We talk about stewardship in low voices, as though it were a tender thing that might break if handled too loudly. Once, a student stayed after class and asked how one measures the weight of dignity. I told her there is no scale for it. There is only the slow accounting of attention. Sometimes the public record swells. Sometimes the papers gather new readers who treat our choices like case studies. That is inevitable. I welcome some of it. Clarity, debate, the hardening of principles into policy. But the ledger will always contain margins that are not ledgerly. The margin where Emily set the kettle. The margin where David planted the rowan and forgot.
The margin where an unremarked cassette breathes one last human pause. Those margins are where tenderness lives, and where I return. Tonight, as the rain eases and the ash smell lifts from the riverbank, I fold the ribbon and slide it back into the drawer. I lock it not to withhold the world, but to keep a small holiness intact. Outside, somewhere, someone hums a note they do not remember learning. Inside, the house breathes. We keep tending what was entrusted to us, imperfectly and persistently. And in that tending, we discover that stewardship is less about rules than fidelity, an ongoing promise to let a life be more than what can be known at a glance.